This work session of the Board of Education for November 14th, 2022 is called to order. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. This is our first work session to discuss potential changes to the district's foundation fundraising policy. The current timeline, just to give a little bit of background on what we're doing here tonight and what's coming up, the current timeline is that we're holding this work session tonight. We're going to have another work session on December 6th, where hopefully we're going to be able to give board direction to staff regarding any potential changes that the board wants to see in the fundraising policy. After that December 6th meeting, the work is going to shift to the policy committee. Thank you, Director Lowry, for pushing that through at the policy committee, which is then going to, based on that direction from the board, is going to craft a detailed policy that is expected to come back to the board for consideration in February with final approval in March. I just want to acknowledge right up front, and I sent an email about this earlier, if you haven't seen it, there are quite a few documents that are being provided this evening, and that I know that some of you, including myself, have not had time to review either the presentation that we received on Friday or the historical information around foundation fundraising that staff has pulled together. And is that what's in this booklet, Roseanne? So thank you so much. Kara, thank you so much for the binders. This is really very, very helpful to get the material. So just given that, I know it was very late and somewhat last minute. So I just want to recognize for everyone that it's okay to be at this meeting without having fully reviewed the PowerPoint, without having reviewed the historical documents. The goal, as I think Director Lowry working with staff, was really to set this meeting up as a way to begin to ground us in introduce this, really talk about some of the history, talk about where we are right now, talk about some of the data tonight as well. And that's really the goal of tonight. We're going to have plenty of time to ask questions tonight. We're going to have time to ask questions over the next few weeks. And then after we get through all the materials tonight, I will come back to sort of ask the sense of the board of whether the current timeline that I just laid out, work session tonight, work session December 6th, moving to the policy committee from there, and whether that still works or whether the board wants to potentially revise that timeline, whether we need to add another work session, whether we need to push back. So be thinking about that tonight as well as we're going through this material. So I'm really excited to get going on this conversation. I mean, I shouldn't say get going. The conversation's been going on for a long time. I'm excited to bring the whole board together tonight to have this conversation and begin moving forward on this body of work. And it's one of the things that I really wanted at the beginning of this year as chair. I want to make sure that we take a good look at this, and I think there are some revisions that I'd like to see in the foundation policy, but again, it's going to be up to the will of the board in terms of where folks want to go. But I'm excited to have this work session tonight, and I believe I'm going to be turning it over to you, Jonathan, so you can help lead us through tonight.
Great, thank you so much. So as you shared, there's a lot of information here. The majority of this information you all did receive on October 25th over the year, and so this is a different composition of the material that you've received previously. So in that spirit, let's move forward with the next slide here for the objectives of tonight. As Chair Scott pointed out, we want to want to spend the first 20 minutes building a shared understanding of the timeline for completing revisions to the fundraising policies. We want to spend the next section around making sure we review the data, the parent fundraising totals of local school foundations for the last 5 years, how that translates to the purchases of FTE. We'll do a little bit of a dive there. We'll review some data around the PPS parent fund. And then lastly, we will review community feedback that we've gathered from previous sessions. As it's just a matter of practice, here are our norms. Stay engaged, speak your truth, experience discomfort, expect and accept non-closure, listen for understanding and empathy, and assume good intentions. So as Chair Scott pointed out, today we are having our first work session on where we're reviewing this information. On December 6th, our hope is that we would get together again with the board to hear general direction from you all on shifts to the fundraising policy. We would reconvene as a policy committee in January with the policy committee to propose and amend any changes to the policy, fundraising policy based on the general direction by the board, and then with the hope that the board votes to ratify this in March. I know that Chair Scott is going to ask board members at the end of the board meeting if there are any revisions that you'd like to make here, so we can revisit that at that point. So just want to set the context here. As you all know, fundraising is dynamic, it's multifaceted, but today we're here to talk about local school foundations, specifically affiliated and independent foundations, and we'll get to what those titles and definitions all mean. But I just want to give you a sense of some ways that you might hear PPS parents giving to our schools. Folks donate time, resources, money to school PTAs, to parent-led nonprofit organizations, to booster clubs, to local school foundations, and to directly to schools. So those are just some ways. They're not exclusive. They're not. I'm sure that I'm missing some, but it just gives you a sense that it's more than just local school foundations. It's more dollars come in a variety of ways to schools.
Can I ask though about that? Because so are the bubbles relative?
They're not to scale.
They're not to
they're
scale.
for illustration purposes only.
And then are some of those restricted funds in terms of how they can be used?
Sure, I think for the majority, that's a great question.
Athletics.
Yeah, I think most I would say most donors have an intent where when they make the donation. So they're giving to local school foundations. There's an intent that those dollars are going to go to staffing, for example. Dollars that go to booster clubs, the intent would probably be athletics, right?
Okay. That's thank you.
So one of the things that's not that maybe would be good to add, that historically has been one way that parents made a leverage dollars to PPS was by giving to the local option, which translates to about $100 million a year, and then also to our bonds. Changed over time, but historically, that's where a big driver.
That's great. Thank you. So there's a lot here on this timeline. I just want to highlight a few things to, again, ground us. In May 12, 1994, the PPS Foundation was established. This was after the passage of Measure 5 in 1990. We see the fundraising escalate. And so a new guidance was issued by the school board May 12th of 1994. In 1998, under Resolution 9577, the board updated guidelines that is around local school foundations that did two specific things. It made it clear that local school foundations were only to be used for staffing, and the exemption of $5,000. The first $5,000 would be exempted. In 2007, the board passed Resolution 3820 that exempted, that increased the exemption to $10,000. And I'll fast forward to 2019 when the Fund for Portland Public Schools was established, and the efforts of managing the local independent foundations emerged under the Fund for PPS. The other timeline or date that I'll share here is in 2021. We did adjust our rules so that foundation dollars paid for actual FTE position, and that independent school foundations provide funding for FTE at the beginning of the year. And you can see the April 2022 memo that highlights that from the CFO, Norberto Delgadillo. So again, grounding us, there are two policies in the school board policies. The first one, District Foundation 7.10.03. Really, the purpose of that policy is to establish the foundation, to say that there is a foundation for the purposes of accepting, holding, and administrating funds and gifts to the district for special and general purposes. 7.10.02P is parent groups in the schools. And all it does to date, it recognizes that parent organizations are necessary and important to achieve student achievement goals established by schools. Again, I want to highlight some rules here, and I want to be very clear. These rules were passed by resolution by the board, not by policy. And so the rules would be that LSFs are required to split every dollar used to fund staffing positions 1/3, 2/3 That was established in 1994. The first $10,000 exempted, that was first established in 98 at 5,000, as I mentioned, and updated in 2007 to 10,000. And LFSS are the only authorized fundraising vehicle for funding staff positions at PPS, and that was established in 1998.
John, can I just ask on
Sure.
that clarification? What was the reason why I mean, I understand there's a difference between policies and rules in terms of how we document them. Is there any practical difference there that you were pointing out? I mean, if we adopt something by resolution, it carries pretty much the same weight as a policy. Am I right about that?
Well, I would defer to our general counsel.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I just want to make sure there wasn't something
I think I'm making the differentiation because I think it's not in board policy now, and so there's questions about whether or not we were there's fidelity to these rules, but there's been fidelity to the rules for the last since they've been established. I think that's maybe the different. I'm trying to make a differentiation there.
It's good to be exact.
Yeah.
So the next slide here I just want to know for during the last 4 years, about half of our elementary schools have an active fundraising effort to fund school staff. Just a third of our middle schools, 4 out of 9 high schools, and about 60% of our PK8s. This current school year, this current fiscal year, if you will, or this current academic year, we saw a decline of -5 at the elementary, same at middle school, -1 at the high school, and -2 at the PK. So just want to point out what that is.
How do you define active?
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I think there are 3 things that and we're going to get to those slides in a bit. There's active foundations, inactive foundations, and independent foundations. Active foundations, active affiliated foundations are those organizations or schools that have parent leadership, a president and a treasurer, and an activity, fundraising activity that happens in the school towards FTE. So that's the affiliated active foundations.
And so just a clarifying question. So each of those schools that are active, do they actually buy FTE, or is there a difference between those that have, there's a difference between having a leadership and raising money and actually purchasing FTE?
I think they
all strive toward, I put that way. They strive towards purchasing FTE. I think I don't want to speak out of turn. That's a good question. I can come back to you.
And I was just going to say, an example I have is when I was the president at Sellwood. One year we didn't raise enough we didn't purchase FTE that year. We saved it for the next year so we could purchase FTE from 2 years worth of fundraising.
Yeah, I guess that would to me be pretty easy to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just don't have it.
That's a question you guys can get back before December 6th.
Yeah.
Like,
So
I can look at it.
So yeah, and I think active versus inactive. So I like to say every school welcomes private donations, right? Dollars that come in. So if what's a school that doesn't have a donation? Arleta. If you're saying I have $10,000 that I want to give to Arleta, you can get it. You can donate it to the local school foundation. They don't have an active foundation. They're not actively recruiting, but we will take that money. And so that's what you'll see. If you see, in some of your data, all under the unaffiliated data, there's dollars there. Someone may donate $50 monthly. They've been doing it for 20 years, and they just kind of stayed there, right? So you see these dollars in unaffiliated. Independent foundations are that word, independent. They have their own board of directors. They have their own operations. They have their own 501c3. They operate independently and have their own independent board of directors. Operationally, what that means is that we invoice, right? Invoice them.
That's previously how
Previously, we invoice, and now
they project what they're going to pay for in the next school year and write one big check basically
at the
by
beginning of the
30.
year. At the beginning of the year.
Yeah.
So those are the differences between the 3. So that leads to, I'll stop there. This is just stop there. Any questions, comments?
Did you say, so one's active, isn't active also affiliated or?
Correct.
Okay,
So
and
active.
then independent, and what was the third?
There's
Inactive affiliated.
Affiliated.
Thank you.
There's a list in the front of the binder, if that's helpful, and for anyone of those schools.
So this, this.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments about this section?
So I have a comment on the 28 years of community generosity. Since this is just a small amount of our overall funding and the rest comes from our community as well, it seems, to me, it seems relevant because there's a lot happened externally from 1994, Measure 5 passed to today. So we have Student Success Act, $100 million a year annually in the local option. PPS is the only district in the state that gets $30 million a year from the GAP bond. We have Measure 98 funds and the art tax, which collectively add about $150 million a year. Was not the case then, plus the Student Success Act, which was not the case when originally the whole model started. The other thing I think would be interesting to add in here is when the equity funding was added in, because that changed, I think also how we looked at how our school should be funded in terms of staffing.
The
Do you
one
mean
third,
our
two third?
PPS equity
Yeah,
funding or the parent fund?
No,
Oh, on the PPS side.
the PPS side, because
Our
that's
staffing formula.
the 8% piece, because that's really what, I mean, I'm looking at like where are the big levers that changed things financially for a lot of our schools.
I do think that's a really critical point that you're making about our staffing formula, because I've talked to so many people in the community who have heard some information about our conversations about foundations, and they have no idea that we fund our schools rather disproportionately based on need, and that in fact schools with foundations are our lowest funded schools in the whole district. And most parents, when you have that conversation, they're like, wow, I had no idea. But that's understandable because it didn't used to be that way.
So the other thing that I think is just useful is data on parent support for our local option, because one of the themes I heard in the community engagement is, hey, we want to do this from, I think, all parties. Like we should all be in it together, raising funds, and that is the highest leverage way in which parents can raise money for our schools, which is the option. So I'd like to see where the fund for PPS, so the data on how much the fund for PPS and individual foundations or PTAs have provided over the years for our local option.
Yeah, well, I can tell you the fund for PPS was established in 2019. So it would have only gone through maybe one election cycle, and the fund was not in that position then. In terms of historical look from All Hands Raised, I'm happy to reach out to All Hands Raised to see what type of
That
data.
was I was actually chair. That was determined basically illegal in about 2000. About 2008, it was a
For
violation of
foundations.
donor intent to fund campaigns with money that had been intended for direct investments in schools. So that's when the Portland Schools Foundation stopped making those
Actually, that's not true, 'cause-
institutional commitments to the bond, to the levies.
Actually, that's not true, because like for the Friends of Lincoln, and thank you, Peyton, because they have always generously supported the local options and the bonds. So I guess that would be a good big data point to have, whether there's any sort of legal reason why.
We can provide that to
It
the
actually
board.
wasn't illegal, it's just a violation of donor intent, which is for a 501c3,
Those are different
a
questions.
significant
Those are
issue.
different
Yeah.
questions as to the effect on the donor of making the
Well, I wanna make
contribution
sure
to
that we're
the
clear,
foundation
'cause
expending.
I don't want Lincoln or any of our other friends that have helped us raise money to have done anything.
I think we've,
Well, Friends of Lincoln is also unique because they're raising for everything at the school, not just
There's other
staffing, so
examples, and the fund's given money, so I think we should just
Yeah,
be very clear instead of.
All right, so we're going to move on to the next section, which is local school foundations by the dollars. So as you can see in this slide here, we provided you with 5 years of data. What you see at the top is the purple. That is total of active, non-active, and independent total raised. So as you can see, we go from 2017-18 at $4.2 million to last or 2020-21 at 2.2 or 2.0, 2.7 this last fiscal year. It also right in between the purple and the green, you can see both the independent and the non-active, the independent and the active affiliated local school foundations. I think it's important to draw attention to the blue and red line. Because so just to know, and you have this document in front of you with the list of schools, we're talking about the blue being 8 independent foundations being able to, or who are raising in 2017-18 2.3 versus 32 affiliated that raise about 1.8. So I want to name that because I know that just for you to understand the data that we're talking about 8 independent foundations who raised, again, 2.3 versus the 1.0 to equal to 4.2 in 17-18. But all of this, represents, again, and I just want to provide that context, less than 1% of the average school's total resources. And we went through the definitions of all of these earlier, so move on to the next slide. This is the total dollars raised by local school foundations. As a reminder, the formula, if you will, is the first $10,000 that are raised are exempted, and then everything else above that gets distributed 1/3, 2/3. So as you can see here, the 2/3 is the bottom dark blue, and the 1/3 that is contributed to the parent fund is just above there.
So just, this is gonna be a super rough estimate, but there's not the number of schools here, but you said there was 8 and 32 for 40, say we have 80 schools. So say in 21, 22, 40 schools raised 1.9 and 40 school and kept it, and then 40 schools kept 800, were distributed 810. I know not all of them got it because they did not get equity
Sure.
grants, but
That's a fair generalization. Yeah. I think we'll note just on this previous slide here, and you can see the dip happen between 2019-20, 2021. That's when the pandemic hit. So you can imagine a lot of the flux that happened there. The next slide is dollars raised by school this last fiscal year, and I just wanted to share with you a comparison here. You can see Dunaway at the with 272,000 at the top, Gray at 17,000 again there. Anything that's in orange, and I apologize, I did miss Grant at the bottom. That just means high schools, just for comparison's sake.
curious, there's 31 here versus 40. What's the difference?
Yeah, just because last year everybody didn't mobilize. Probably.
That's a good question. I can look for here. Hosford. So Hosford did not raise any money last year.
Most of it.
Passwords on the non-active, not the affiliated active. Sorry.
So Grant here, were they non-active
They're not active.
this year?
That was a big situation for the staffing for their Japanese. Way I know. Independent.
I'll get back to you to see which ones are missing in here. You said how many were in here?
Well, I just counted 31. And just the previous 2 pages before, you said there was 40 that were either independent or active.
Yeah.
Well, on this active, if you look at this list you gave us, Jonathan, for this, so that's the part of the problem. This is the 22-23 year. This is 21-22. So on the 22-23, we have 26 affiliated active and 8 independent.
34.
21-22, it might be different.
So
Oh,
most
yeah,
likely.
Actually, here's what it is. So, and this might just be on my part. So I'm looking at the data that you have, which is, you have all of that data in here.
I'm looking at the presentation. Sorry.
What was that?
I'm looking at
Yeah,
the presentation.
what was that?
I'm looking at the presentation.
No, I know. So, but you also, one of the attachments was the one with 5 years of historical data.
Yes.
That information, for example, has Reiki. As you can see, Reiki in 2021. No, that wasn't. I'll have to get back to you.
That's fine. I guess, I'm curious, it's 21, 22 versus 22, 23?
22, 23 is currently happening, so they're fundraising as we speak. This is last year's fiscal year fundraising dollars.
For that pays for this year.
That pays for this fiscal year. So we'll get back to you to see which ones are missing, I'm sure.
There were some last year that just didn't wake back up.
But I'll make sure. Thank you for catching that. Okay, any discussion or questions beyond?
Do you have a question back in the other section about the timeline? In the last year's policy committee meetings, we talked about the changes that were made to have, because the practice used to be you could buy the staff, secure the staff, and then pay for it during the year, and that got backloaded, but we were told it was backloaded until June 30th, and I'm curious, but then we found out later it moved to August 31st. What was the reason it went from the 30th to, it moved back 2 months later, and then how many schools raised money during that time period? I'm assuming it got extended and schools raised more money, but how much money was raised in that time period beyond what we had been told was going to be the deadline?
Yeah.
We don't know what they raised in that time period. I don't know that they were actively fundraising it. It was more of, they were still trying to understand the amounts they were being invoiced and finalizing their payments for June, and then making a plan for what they were gonna pay, doing different projections of, if we pay for this position, what will it be?
Yeah, and I think
It wasn't active.
so. And the documents are in your packet. In April of 2021, we made the first announcement to the independent foundations that those changes were happening. So that was April 2021. A year later, April 2022, the CFO, which you have included in your packet, a memo, where he indicated that we provided 2 extra months to make sure that folks could make the transition. Again, understanding that it was a new transition for foundations, and we wanted to be adaptable, not punitive in how we engage them. I can tell you, we received all but 2 before the 8/31, and we received the other 2 on 9/8, and it's just one actually.
So they got, I'm just trying to understand, because the other reform, which was people were actually paying for the staff person that they said. So they got an invoice, you're purchasing an EA, this is what the cost is to the district. They got invoiced for that one. So they designate here's the one, and then they get invoiced, and then they were going to pay by June 30th, but instead the deadline got.
In April of 2022, we clarified that we were giving an additional 2 months to provide that. That is the last time we are doing it. Moving forward, as was indicated in that April 22 memo, that moving forward, June 30th is the deadline. So I just want to be clear, we were trying to be, we wanted to be flexible.
The invoices are given in May, and so they wanted to see how the year ended, and then make their plan with their principal for what they were paying for the next school year.
I have copies of checks for folks too. All right, we can move on to the next item, which is the FTE funded by local school foundations. Again, I just want to set the context here. Less than 1% of teachers and licensed PPS staff are funded by local school foundations, and just over 1% of teaching assistants and classified PPS staff are funded by local school foundations. Here is this information for the last 4 years. So of the how many FTE were funded by local school foundations by category. So as you can see, I'll start with the light blue education assistants. We see in 1920, 24.8, 9.3, and 21. And we start to see a uphill 14.74 and 17.49.
So Jonathan, this includes all the FTE purchases, so those purchased by local school foundations and those purchased also by the PPS parent?
No, this is just local school foundations. In the next section, we have the FTE funded by parents.
It would be good to see that all together
Okay.
because it's all actually
Sure.
going to the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
In teachers, we see in 1920, we go from 20, 11, this last year, 5.29, and this current year, 6.86. So there's 6.86 FTE teachers funded by the local school foundations this current school year across 80 schools. And as folks will know, half of our schools are have active foundations. So, and then you can see some of the other numbers here. The three biggest being education assistant, teacher, and administrative and office support.
And in how many of these cases, as I remember, Jonathan, you were presenting to the policy committee, you used Bridal Mile as an example of them using their foundation dollars to address some of the needs of historically underserved students. Of these FTE, how many of them does the district staff direct what the money is spent on, or is it a school-based decision?
These are all school-based decisions. So this is the total FTE funded by local school foundations for the last 4 years. So as you can see here, over the last 4 years, you have Dunaway, Laurelhurst, Ainsworth, Lincoln, Richmond, Forest Park, Llewellyn, Buckman at the top of our, or some of the top of our list here. So these are schools with a minimum of 1 FTE purchase in the last 4 years.
What order, is this just in the same order as the next page, but it's a 4 year, so it's actually different?
Correct.
Okay.
So this is 4 years total, and then this one is just looking at this current calendar or current school year. So what's actually happening in our schools today.
What was done last year? What was raised last year?
What was raised last year
What
for
it bought this year?
correct.
Yeah.
So here, this is I like this graph. Maybe I don't know. It's just the colors, and maybe for me, but you can see the way in which these dollars or these FTEs kind of shift. So you see education assistants, 24, 9, 14. So you see that going up as we go along, but we see folks, the teacher positions not being paid for as much in these last few years. And then you can see 3.5 administrative and office support.
Yeah, I definitely would like to see one graph that shows it all together with the parent fund, what they bought on the same place with what else.
Jonathan, there was a slide missing,
Which one?
this one, the one that's the 2023.
This one? Yeah, I just went through it. Sorry.
Yeah.
So it's, sorry, that was the 4-year one, and then this is this is what's happening in our schools right now.
Yeah, so I think what would be helpful, and actually for all the schools, is to look at it from, because one thing that I'm interested in having a deeper conversation is these schools that don't apply, don't have equity funding, and yet they still have students that are combined underserved and directly certified, and how do they get any discretionary dollars, because right now they just have staffing formula, and yet they still serve a combined underserved. So to get after that though, I think, because it's complicated, but to look at like the demographics, so when I look at Dunaway, like 5% direct certified, combined underserved is 28, Black 0, Native American 0, and you can do that all the way across. But I think that gives us then like, and also then who gets equity dollars to get a fuller picture of, and I think a lot about what we heard about the class sizes is people who might have a student who has been underserved or is struggling, and they don't have any way to, maybe they don't have a foundation, so there's no EAs or whatever. And so like, how does the district look at providing support for those students? Is it just the staffing formula? Because there's a way to support those students if you have a foundation, but not if you are in that sort of middle.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I'm gonna actually try.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to that actually. So, I mean, it's the right question, and it's one we've contemplated for a couple of years actually. So I know we're talking about foundations here. You saw at our last work session, ERS validate that our designated state identified schools have been getting funded 54% more than the average school. And we're glad that a lot of our schools have been exited. Question for us, as we've been meeting with school leadership teams, is, and of those interventions and supports, which are the most important to hang on to, because we want to do a gradual release. Those same supports are probably would have gotten them improved results. We don't want to pull the rug out from under them. But where we really want to fine tune our next evolution of our budget is there's a whole group of schools in the middle, and even those here that have student groups that are not yet at grade level expectation, that also will benefit from some capacity to provide targeted interventions and supports. And so how do we ensure that there's a mechanism and a reserve to be able to implement a more holistic view across our school portfolio, so every school has an ability to make sure the second graders are reading at grade level, or the ninth graders getting support in mathematics, or whatever it is, because it's true. You just asked the question. Some of the foundations are to support. It may not necessarily be a targeted intervention for a set of students not at grade level, and we feel an obligation and a responsibility to make sure that that's in place. So the only question is, with all the competing priorities, can we make sure that we have enough resources, time, people, money to support students who have been underserved at any one of our schools, because we know they exist in every school.
And maybe a little different way to frame that, I've had this conversation with Chief Dogadil many times, and this is probably for me, my top priority in our budget process now, like how can we direct more of our resources to follow the students? Because I've seen what it's like to have, 200 historically underserved school kids in a building that receives zero equity dollars, zero additional staffing. Talk to James McGee about how he does everything he can to try to find ways to support his Black students typically, but he's got none of those other sources of funding. So instead of just like having these thresholds that are based on the percentage of your student body, how can we be more creative about following the student with the resources that they need and deserve?
Yeah, so as the board has seen, we've triaged our neediest schools first, and we've seen, the combination of practices and shifts and strong leadership in those schools. We've seen the progress. We know that would be of assistance and support to a whole lot of other schools that have students who are similarly not achieving at the rate that we would like. So that's where we're hoping this spring superintendent's budget recognition starts to speak to. How do we get to the broader set of students across schools in the system? Again, it depends on all the competing priorities and making sure there's enough fund reserve to do that.
Just to thank you. This is really useful, and I would actually love, as ERS is continuing to do its work, what we got was sort of designated schools and non-designated schools. And it would be really interesting to see, is there currently a cliff there, or if we sort of showed resources disaggregated by all the schools, is there a general drop? What I hear you saying is we want a general drop down. That's the goal. And
right.
How we get there.
So the resources available to any school community, those are within our sphere of influence. So for me, it's whether they're officially on a state accountability list or not. They haven't arrived at the level that we want them to exhibit in the way of excellence. What level of resources we'll make available there, gradually releasing a little bit. That's why it's important that we're asking our principals right now, 5 to 7 extra FTEs you've had over the last number of years, while ODE has not refreshed those accountability lists. Which 2 or 3 were the most important? If you had to rank these, which ones made the most difference? And there's also some promising practice there that we can learn from, where other schools also have Black and Native students, for instance, which are our board goals. So yeah, it's an issue of how we as a school system are going to make sure that there's a level of resource available that's sufficient to get at many more, that's sort of the next level of schools. And also, we need a proxy, because we have less schools that are CSI, TSI. We need another, we're doing some internal conversation around, well, how do we identify, is it demographics? Is it free reduced lunch? What are other ways to making sure that we're continuing to prioritize across the school system?
I mean, if I were to summarize, Sandra, is like, there's steps, and they're pretty big steps. Like 80%, you get a half a media specialist, and some other things. If you have 80% combined underserved, and then so you have some steps. The foundation, like, I think, makes the steps less big, the riser less big. But then you get to a cliff if you're at 15. If you have fewer than 15% direct certified and fewer than 40% combined underserved, like, that's when you just get like what everybody else gets. And so if you want to change that and help any of those students who might need extra assistance, you're doing it through your regular staffing formula, which is, pretty much dictated to, like, you're going to do this much art, this much PE, and this, here's how many classroom teachers you get. So it's a
Yeah, no, I'm glad we're all recognizing the need and an approach that would help many more of our school communities and students.
And then we get back to the bigger issue in the room, which is that, Oregon is not at the quality education model. The state doesn't sufficiently fund our schools. Yes, there's been lots of strides made, but we know that we don't actually receive the resources we need to do the things that our students need to get them to the level that we want to see as a board.
Rich conversation. I'd like to move on unless there's anything.
Yes, go for it. Thank you.
FE teaching positions, I thought it was important to share, if you double click, and when we say teachers, you hear a lot of conversations or dialogue about, these all pay for teachers. As you can see here, it pays for, it contributes to assistants and teachers. And this double click here, you can see, the biggest areas are the K-5 homeroom teachers. I want to know where it says 9-12 core classroom should actually say 6-12 core classroom. So that's just a accident on my part. Didn't want to make a change.
What was that, Jonathan?
Where it says 9-12 core classroom should say 6-12. And the reference, just if you want to look at the data is also included in these sheets. So you can this was all pulled out of from this information. So all of this data there's original sources right here. So if you want to take a look at that. So that's where I noticed that some of the secondary core teachers were included middle school. So that's why I meant to say 6 to 12.
Across the whole district.
Correct.
I'm just curious, it's a required subject. Why are schools having to buy even a small amount of PE? Is that because they're being given like 0.8?
I think what I've heard is that some want class sizes to go down. So in the instance, for example, of physics class, there's a desire to bring the classroom.
I meant just PE.
Oh,
It's a required,
There's
it's a
no one
required class.
doing PE this year, right?
Yeah, nobody's funding PE this year. Last year it was 0.2. The year before was 0.9. So I can look at what school and get back to you to what specific. We actually have the data right here. So let's.
It ends up being a load issue for those teachers that you got one teacher in a K-5 building who has every single kid in the whole school for PE.
Yeah, so it looks like, let's see, in 2020, Axis 0.1, 2021, Buckman 0.09, Dunaway 0.2 in 2021, 0.2 in Dunaway 2022, Reiki 0.25 in 2020, Skyline 0.638 2020. But as you can see,
So the foundations are buying up hours for PE teachers.
looks
Sounds
like,
Like making it to going from 0.8 to a full FTE.
could look like that. Probably, yeah. If you're saying a 0.2, then it's probably
We could pull up what our phys ed allocation for staffing on those costs.
Great. Thanks, John.
all right. This is the same type of chart, just with the assistant positions. As you can see, the majority, if not, I mean, all but you know, the majority, overwhelming majority, are in elementary education assistants.
So I have a question about
Please.
this, and it's also about the timing, and this is like, and it's a different type of equity. But if foundations are allowed to purchase FTE and they do that at the end of the year, my assumption is there's no school that's, for example, purchasing an EA, an education assistant, who isn't actually there or they haven't actually hired. Like you don't start the school year with a unfilled EA position
If it was funded by the local school
if it's
foundation.
right? So,
That's a good assumption.
and this is like a kind of a parking lot issue to like how to wrestle with it. If all the foundation EAs are filled and we have unfilled EA positions at the beginning of the school year, how is that impacting equity? Same thing with teacher staffing positions. So just think about how we make sure that every school who needs EA, whether it's paid for by a foundation or the district, has that position's filled. Because we know all the foundation ones are filled.
Yeah, that's a good observation for the times we're in. When you're at a moment in time when the talent pool is limited, then those folks are already situated. Because even if we made a decision, which we should ponder, is in PPS, we're going to provide a kindergarten EA in every classroom. You know? Would we be able to find them? Right. So there's the question of, you know, what's feasible to be implemented. But it does create this dilemma of the personnel that we do have, if they're being situated in some schools and not others.
And the reason I ask is, you know, sometimes when you look at somebody, like you go to a school visit, you look at their staffing before you go there. I'm like, hey, this is like a pretty well-staffed school. And I'm like, yeah, but we have 5 vacancies. And it's sort of like, well, on paper, it looks like they're fully staffed. They either, you know, sometimes have long-term subs or a bunch of openings. So just think about how we address that piece of the equity.
Everybody listening, consider applying to PPS.
Yeah, I'm wondering, talking about the talent pool, because that is an important question. Is it possible for teachers, not for teachers program, but teaching programs at Lewis and Clark State, for instance, to use their second year students or their graduate students?
I'm all for
I mean, I know you,
creative brainstorming, and we are in close contact with every college of ed in the region and beyond. We're present in all kinds of recruitment fairs. We're putting the word out, various mediums and sites, and we're working with PESBC to see where can we eliminate some of these institutional barriers as well. So that's on top of all of our Grow Your Own programming, classified, you know, teaching positions if possible. Hopefully encourage some people to consider public ed through, you know, a lot of emergency sub experience. Maybe they're giving it another thought. I don't want to take the words out of our chief of HR.
You
Want to
hit
add
on all of
anything?
that.
everything.
Bigger topic.
We also differentiate our support to schools with new principals, right? So who haven't been able to carry over staffing and CSI, TSI schools during the staffing process. So we have differentiated support to schools that struggle more with staffing.
You all are familiar with this slide here. You saw it last week at the presentation from the ERS. But as a reminder, together, PPS is differentiating staffing ratios and equity formula direct approximately 40% more staff to higher need schools and students. So as you can see here, a school A with no designation, this is what they would get in a medium K-5 elementary school here in PPS, well, about 350 students. And so this is a comparison tool just to provide context, general context here. If you're a TSI school, you will get 2.5 FTE above and beyond school A. If you're a Title I only school, then you're looking at 4 FTE or 21% above and beyond school A. And CSI schools are 7.2 or 38%. So again, this was in your packet last week. So what we added here, what we asked ERS to add is, including foundation funded FTEs. What we saw is that PPS still directs more staff to higher needs. So this is based on, as you can see, base foundation FTE, for the median K-5 school of 350 and 58 students. Again, this is just a comparison tool. We know that the numbers are not 0.4. They're much higher, in some instances, or much lower in others. So, you're looking at 0.4 FTE addition to those non-designated schools. And so then that brings down, the differences just slightly by 0.4, as you can see here.
I just want to make sure your point here is one of magnitude.
Right.
40% increased funds through our sort of equity funding is far dwarfs any impact of the foundation for us. Okay.
But the other really simple way to look at that, which I don't think you included in here, but it's in our volume 2 of our budget book, is just dollars per student in a given building, because that includes foundation funding and then it includes all the inputs from our staffing formula, and it just lays it out really starkly. That we see almost double between those at the top and those at the bottom.
Yeah.
Which is essential, which is intentional.
Yes, and important.
Intentional, absolutely, yeah.
I will, again, just highlight in your packet, you have data. We try to provide it in different ways as possible. So you have it by school, FTE funded by school, by fiscal year. You have it by total sum by school. You have it by type of position. You have it by a double-click subcategory as well. You have it by bargaining unit, and then you have the raw data. So again, we're trying to provide all the information for you all to make the decision, or to have an informed conversation about the direction of the foundations.
So I'm curious, so you take like one of the schools on the raising more dollars, the EAs, or EAs. Do you think that makes a measurable difference from an academic standpoint? I mean, I guess that's a
Well, it
question.
depends which students we're talking about that they're assisting and supporting. Also, I recall we saw a slide last week that showed our schools that were not benefiting from our equity center school budgeting and staffing are still at 70% proficient. And yet these school communities notice needs, would like to enrich their program, they're expanding the offerings, but it would really depend on sort of looking at a specific site and if they were making some deliberate choices about those fundraised positions and who's learning they were.
I mean, the reason I ask is just because I'm involved in that whole conversation about funding and what PPS offers and then what the community has to come up with is originally the foundations were paying for things like for the art tax, they were paying for PE, I mean the whole host of things, and the composition of what they're paying for, and this is more at the elementary level. Because the middle school, so I don't know what happens to middle school parents. I guess like middle school students, so that
It
gets real. But the elementary students, so it seems like it's more like now in the classroom, which does seem, having had a student struggle, that does seem like it would make a measurable difference. Versus like, hey, my kid's getting PE because we raised foundation money, but like actually in the classroom they're getting support. So I'm just curious, like whether the district has done any sort of analysis of, all these schools that raise different money for different types of positions, and does it make a difference? And if so, and we've already said, like, here's our equity formula, like, if we're gonna be providing that, parents are providing that extra assistance in one class, should we be like moving the whole, that's what makes a difference, moving everything up?
I think this
that.
is
I'd like to
getting
hear-
close to one of the central issues for our whole policy conversation on this, which is, we're very strategic with our own investments. And so if we're gonna continue to allow external support for our schools, then how do we have a conversation about being more directive with our building leaders about who we want that support to serve or how we want that support to be deployed in those schools? Because that's something we could do. And right now it really is just up to the principal.
And I think
So
a fundamental,
I'd like to hear.
yeah, a fundamental
what
piece is we do not have enough resources for all of our students, right? That we know that. And so we as a board have chosen to focus the resources we have on the students who need the most support. And we know, we've heard from many communities with kids in the middle or those steps you were talking about, Julia, that we're not able to meet. And so, I mean, I think the fundamental question is before us as a board that we're not going to talk about tonight, but we will in the future is, are we going to continue to allow parents to fund these extra positions that we know students need and that we don't have the resources to fund? And how do we do so equitably with integrity? And that's the conversation before us. And so we're getting grounded in all the data and the information as we begin to think about, I think if all of us want the best for our students and all of us want to meet our board goals, the question is, what are the levers that we have access to make that happen? And this is a very specific conversation we'll be having about the foundations and how we as a board will allow that program to look in the future.
Yeah,
And
that's
sort of
actually,
the
this is jumping
fundamental
ahead to the actual discussion. I'm interested.
Right,
in the-
that's-
Well, can I just, the question that, and it's maybe for the next conversation, but I'd like to hear from staff what we think that impact of that additional staff makes for those students. And maybe it's like, hey, kids have more personal attention because they're ZAs or teachers, but just like in terms of the data, I would like to know kind of what we think or what we know about what impact that has
For
on
the
that.
schools that receive equity funds or for the schools that fund?
For the schools that are actually able to like put more resources, because I say it's been a shift to like used to be, we're saving PE or whatever, art, or we're gonna have art and music, but now it's like we're actually pushing more resources into the class. Foundations are pushing more resources into the classroom, and
Great.
I say I've had a student who struggled. I'm all for pushing more resources in the classroom, but what impact does that have that for those students? Is it a positive things, and do we look at? So that's, I guess, the data question that I'm interested in, because then I want to look
So
at.
does it have a
those.
positive impact?
Yeah, I think people have observed that each year we've continued to iterate, it's public education. I feel like the school system should provide for, those expectations. You see it in our growing principal's handbook or staffing rules, so that, arts pathways are being built out, so more of those positions are covered. Yes, high school's sort of another thing there with our CTE pathways and Measure 98, but and I also don't want to take away the discretion, professional judgment of our school leaders for that conversation to happen with their supervisors and their school improvement plans around where their growth areas and needs are too. And hopefully, and I believe that they're making strategic decisions about where to best apply those. Maybe it's for a set of focal students at a particular grade level or particular content, or another school community, and maybe they want their youngest children to have a lower staff, student adult ratio. The discretion level is it's minimal or more nominal. So we haven't felt the need to sort of get too prescriptive.
Right, but if you don't have foundation dollars, you would have that any choice.
Well, that was my earlier comment, is like, how do we make sure every school leader has some capacity or resource pool to make some discretionary.
So I want to pause this for a second. In our agenda, we were actually going to do public comment at 4:50 today. And I know we still have some slides to go through. And so actually, one of the questions I first have is for the board. Do we want to pause for public comment? But also kind of want to ask the people who are here for public comment if they prefer we go through the rest of the slides, or if they prefer we do public comment now, I'm okay either way. I know we had about 5 people signed up.
That would be better. There's
Great.
probably information that we can bring that would be beneficial as you continue to go through the slides.
Great. I'd be happy. Is the board okay if we pause then and
Yes,
do public
absolutely.
comment? That would be great. So so thanks everybody for being here. How do we want to bring these folks up to maybe sit next to Roseanne to do the public comment so we can make sure it's picked up by the mic? That would be great.
Do we have one that's online, like a video submission?
There's only one person who submitted a video.
I was about to read off the name, but Kara, you're here. Kara, who do we have here for public comment?
We have Will Musser.
Thank you for being here. And we won't do our normal spiel about public comment. Just state your name. I think we have 2 minutes tonight, right, for folks, and so we'll give you a gentle reminder when we get to
Okay. Thank you. Will Musser, Musser. Thank you for your time. My name is Will Musser, and I've reviewed the Reform PPS funding site, watched the relevant board meetings on YouTube, and reviewed the materials and dissertation. And sorry to be blunt, but I have 2 minutes. Any move towards eliminating local school foundations, otherwise known as LSFs, and solely having district-wide fundraising for distribution is irresponsible because of the imminent budget cuts that will eliminate teaching positions. It's letting the perfect be the enemy of the good and is an example of a receding tide that lowers all boats. This summer, I became the chair for the Beaumont Foundation, despite not serving on any LSF before, because no one else wanted to. I chose to because I had ideas about activities for community building, fundraising, and tying in my advocacy for climate action with Alameda and Rigler communities. At an earlier meeting, a board member asked, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? And the consensus is that eliminating LSFs and replacing them with district-wide fundraising will reduce the perception of inequity in fundraising for staffing, but at what consequences to PPS? And why not address PTAs and boosters? Today is the first time that people affiliated with specific LSFs are speaking publicly as to how PPS would be impacted by prohibiting LSFs to pay for staff. To date, the committee has not operationalized definitions of equity or parity as they relate to inputs or outcomes with respect to staff funding, putting the cart before the horse. It has not distinguished between disparities or inequities. PPS stakeholders need to have an honest discussion about what the heat map would look like if spending and fundraising for staff were equitable as well as practical. If you eliminate LSFs, you squelch or even negate the practical power of self-interest to raise money. Gross revenue from district-wide fundraising would be significantly reduced because donors of all backgrounds would be reluctant to donate as much because the incentives are uncertain. And alongside decreased enrollment and budget cuts, that would be irresponsible. Undeserved students will fall through the cracks. Disparities will become exacerbated and more visible, leading to greater dissatisfaction with PPS. So you'll probably lose families and teachers to private schools. Families are willing to compromise, but when the decisional balance crosses over and attending PPS is seen as a sacrifice, they will leave. We'll get 2 minutes, so I'd like to end with this plea. Please reform the system by identifying mandatory staff levels for every school type, increasing the equity percentage upwards, and creating a support system where schools without active LSFs can get them functioning so donations can flow to them directly. As stewards of PPS, the board should be looking at how to increase fundraising levels in a more equitable manner to optimize staffing parity instead of implementing noble but misguided policies that reduce them in today's challenging environment. Thank you.
And I would encourage you also, you feel free to submit your testimony to the board.
I already have. Yep, thank you.
I'm sure it's in my email.
It is.
Thanks for saying.
It is.
Dr. Harriet B. Mignon.
Good evening. I'm Dr. Harriet V. Mignon. I'm the principal at Beaumont. Thank you for this opportunity to speak before the board. The Beaumont Foundation has been very helpful as a building leader. Often when we get our budget for the next year, it's like, oh, I have to cut this many positions. it's really tough to figure out who to cut, where do you cut, and how you fill those gaps back in. So with foundation money as well as the Parent Equity Fund, I'm able to use some of that funding to, if we have a half-time position, sometimes I make it a full-time position using foundation funds because we may need more electives, for example, choir or band. Sometimes we have a half-time, recently we had a half-time bilingual educational assistant that was very proficient in mathematics. So the district gave me a 0.5. I hired him the other 0.5 to help with our math and science classes because he was really able to reach out to the students and help them thrive in those content areas. Additionally, when office staff is cut, I may, for example, right now we have a 1.5 secretary. I hired an additional 0.5 secretary. We now have a bilingual secretary that's able to help us communicate with parents, so that we have 0.5 for her, but I hired her 1.0. She helps with phone calls, communication, anything that parents need from the school. So we try to use our funding to support our students. Sometimes it goes in the classroom, sometimes it goes to support staff. And frankly, if we didn't have that additional support, I'm not sure how we would fully function. I did hear that the schools with foundations are the lowest funded schools, so I'm very grateful for our foundation funding. The last thing I would say is that, yes, please, if you have any more questions for me about foundation and how those funds are used or why the decisions are made, the way they're made, so in the spring we get our FTE, we start making decisions, and then sometimes in the fall, our support staff has gone somewhere else for a higher paying job. So then we have to look for someone to fill those positions. So it's every year it's the hardest thing I have to do is figure out how to fill the gaps based on the funding that I receive. It's very hard to say, okay, sorry, you don't have a job next year. That's tough. It's like I don't sleep those nights. But I do use our funding to support staff and students. So thank you again for this opportunity. If you have more questions, I'm available by email or phone call to you.
Thank you.
Again.
I just wanted to clarify one thing you said, is that Beaumont is unique, I think, because you both have a foundation and you receive parent equity funds.
Exactly.
So there's both pieces of the sort of fundraising and placing benefit Beaumont.
Yeah, and the parent equity funds are used for student groups. We have gender and racial affinity groups. And so we are trying to increase the students' sense of belonging to our school by providing activities and facilitation of group meetings so that they feel like they're connected to our school. Our highest population of students of a different culture is Hispanic. So we're continuing to hire staff that speak Spanish, another way to communicate with parents, and also providing opportunities if students need supplies, school supplies or other things, we also provide those as well. So we use all our resources to try to fit the needs of the students. And yeah, if we can work on that staffing formula. So we have actually, we're not a Title I school, but we do have Title I students. And so when they come to our school, they lose their Title I. The funding that comes with them, it does not follow them to the school. So we're always trying to figure out how to fill the gap for students that needs extra support.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Just looking at this.
Question? All right.
Last year, or 21, 22, 22,000 is what the local school foundation raised?
Yeah, last year was challenging because post-COVID, people weren't connected, people weren't meeting, people weren't coming together, people were afraid to be in public together in large spaces with a lot of people. Most of our foundation activities are in person with parents, and so yeah, people weren't getting together, so that's why.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Gentlemen, as a data point, it would be interesting to know how many schools are in Beaumont's situation, just for future.
Would be interested, like, one, another one.
Karen?
Serena Holmesworth.
All right. Hello, board members, and thank you for allowing me this time to speak. My name is Serena Hollingsworth, and as a person of color, I'm proud to have my children in a district that's committed to equity. But I'm also concerned about the proposal to disband or cap the local school foundations in the name of creating equity. Eliminating teaching positions and increasing class sizes is not equitable and will harm children of color across the district. I am the chair of the Alameda School Foundation. It's no secret that Alameda has a lot of affluent families. Because of the district's equity-based funding model, Alameda receives fewer educators and dollars per student, allowing those resources to go to the schools with greater needs, which is the right approach. However, Alameda still has over 100 students that are historically underserved. The proposal to cap or eliminate the fundraising from our foundation sends the message to those 100 underserved students that you are not a priority. Your equity doesn't matter as much because you attend a more affluent school. Eliminating these funds will also negatively impact the entire district. Using Alameda as an example, in the 21-22 school year, we raised about $121,000. Of that, $37,000 went to the fund for PPS. We'll come back to that figure. This left about $84,000 for Alameda to use. We did not get any educational assistance from the district, so we hired 2 part-time PAs. One rotates between 3 kindergarten classes, the other rotates between 3 second grade classes with class size averages of 31 students. I would ask if, when was the last time any of us sat in a classroom with 31 7-year-olds, and do we think that's a reasonable student to teacher ratio? Pretty sure we'd all say no. The educational assistants bring much needed support by spending one-on-one time with those students in phonics and reading sessions, and many of the students needing this help the most are from our underserved population. The board itself has set goals around 3rd grade reading and required school interventions, and we simply just cannot do that without these EAs at present. I'm almost done. So now let's go back to the $37K that went to the district. I'm really struggling to understand why the board would reject this income in the midst of increasing funding cuts. By capping or eliminating the foundations, it's sending the wrong message, and it implies that the board's willing to place the ideology of a few over the benefit of the student. I'm not an expert in equity, but I know that taking any resources away from any student will not create better outcomes. I hear the critics. The local school foundation model isn't perfect, but until there's a statewide solution that doesn't have 31 second graders in a classroom with 1 teacher, this is what we need. And removing this funding without an alternative harms the entire PPS community. I'm respectfulully asking that the board please do not limit or take this funding away from our students. Thank you for your time. And I will follow up via email with my
Appreciate that. You know where to send it?
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Kara?
So Karen Lau, and she's virtual.
Welcome.
Hello, thank you.
We can hear you, so start whenever you're ready.
All right. Good afternoon. My name is Karen Liao. Liao is 1 syllable and spelled Liao. My pronouns are they, she, and I racially identify as Brown Asian. I am a member of the Reform PPS Funding Advocacy Group. I am a PPS parent with a 7th grader at Hosford Middle School and a 10th grader at Cleveland High School. Both of them went to Abernathy Elementary School, a school that has a foundation. I am also a PPS teacher. I teach 2nd grade at Grout Elementary, which feeds into Hosford and Cleveland. Grout is a Title I school, which does not have a foundation. Like many other school communities which do not have foundations, almost all Grout parents and caregivers knew little to nothing about foundations a few years ago. And I'm sorry, I'm having problems with my 2 screens because of this Zoom setup. There we go. Thank you. We know that foundation fundraising disproportionately benefits schools that serve whiter, wealthier communities. During the 2020-21 school year, the 11 schools that raised more than $50,000 had student populations that were, on average, less than 18% historically and currently ignored. I'm using historically and currently ignored instead of historically underserved because I think this better describes our current racial reality. Compare $50,000 against the $10,000 to $15,000 grants distributed to 48 qualifying schools in 2022-2023. We know that equity means that those who need more get more. The current PPS administration is doing the right thing by putting more of its resources towards schools with the greatest need. Foundation fundraising undermines these efforts to reduce disparities among schools along racial lines. Did you know there has never been oversight on how foundation money is spent at individual schools? PPS's mission statement is, we provide rigorous, high-quality academic learning experiences that are inclusive and joyful. We disrupt racial inequities to create vibrant environments for every student to demonstrate excellence. Why is foundation fundraising outside of any racial equity lens? In the 50+ pages of material shared for tonight's meeting, there was no mention of racial demographics or outcomes. How is PPS's racial equity lens applied when putting this information together? A racial equity lens for foundations on a school-by-school basis will be very uneven as each school comes up with its own practices and policies. Another concern I have is whether or not schools who serve student populations that are less than 18% historically and currently ignored are able to effectively create and apply a racial equity lens. Why in the past was 33% an equitable solution? Why would 50% now be an equitable solution, and how would it close any opportunity gaps? I support a district-wide foundation. This is an opportunity for real equitable change in the foundation fundraising system, not small adjustments that may possibly reduce inequity, but do not eliminate it. Not only is a district-wide foundation a system where racial inequities can be effectively disrupted, but it is also a huge opportunity for community building. Imagine fundraising events that are planned and attended by multiple schools. Imagine events that bring together the multitude of experiences and expertise represented in multiple school communities, so they can support each other and increase understanding of each other's values and priorities. Imagine being in a community where caregivers and parents across the district side by side advocate for stable funding for staffing in all PPS schools. With this current review of PPS foundation policy, there is an opportunity for transformational change. Shifting percentages to 50% is not transformational, and it is not equitable. A district-wide fundraising model not only removes racial disparities in funding extra staff, it is also the first step towards where we really need to be doing, what we really need to be doing. Identifying the true depth of needs in each school and advocating as one district for fully funded schools. Thank you. I'm sorry I went over time.
It's okay. We really appreciate your comments. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kara?
Queuing up the video. This is Christine Space.
Our Vestal journey over the 9 years taught me so much, not only as a parent, but as an active member of the city. The disparity between the schools in this district is blindingly clear and can leave a parent feeling paralyzed in their ability to make any type of change for their children and the children in their community. This is a significant opportunity for PPS school board, district leaders, and community members to do an equity inventory of the current policy and deeply consider other options that we can collectively envision. For years at Vesta Elementary, 50% of the population went to other schools, whether through the lottery system or private. This fact alone is enough to see that statistics and school funding matter more to people than people. We have to start asking ourselves the question, are we leaning on a model that only benefits those fortunate enough to live in a certain zip code? Who gets left behind in this process? The fundraising policy is our little experiment in trickle-down economics, and just as it does not work for our nation, it does not work for our city education system. It is wonderful that people have the means, energy, and time to raise so much money that they can kick down to the students that have families who are barely surviving, families who do not have the bandwidth to question the policies of their local public school system. They just know they want their children to have an education. But I know there must be options that bring our schools and student opportunities closer together. I have my own voice, energy, and time to brainstorm other options, and I believe there are countless others out there just like me in this city that are ready, willing, and able to do better by all of our children. We have an opportunity to make Portland a model example of what it looks like when members of its city work together for true equity and change. I hope you will continue to reach out to others in the McDaniel, Jefferson, and Roosevelt clusters and include our voices in the process of developing a new policy that aligns with the Portland of today and the Portland of tomorrow. Thank you.
So we had signed up. I know we had 3 people on the wait list as well. Are any of those 3 here tonight? They were on the wait list, so they probably not. I think it was Marianne Walker, Maya Van Goldern, and Alicia Riddle.
We were told there would be no slots, we weren't able to have anyone speak.
After those 5. Okay, and I think that I know we have another work session coming up, so the folks on the waiting list get bumped to the top. Is that right? Who have signed up? Or
So we're in a weird situation because we don't normally do public comment at work sessions. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So this was a conversation. We can decide to add that if we so choose.
Well, I would say is that we should make sure that it's done in a way which everybody feels is transparent, because they'll be
Yes.
everybody will feel like
Agreed.
who knew first and
yeah, that's a great point. Maybe I'll put it out, not necessarily for a decision tonight, but for the board to think about. This feels to me like a topic that we want to take more public testimony on rather than less. And I know that other governments, often will have, listening sessions that go on, for an hour or even 2.
Or even
Well, I was not suggesting that. I was suggesting something more than our normal. So maybe just something to think about whether we want to build that into a future time. And
I would be in favor of adding more
to your point, Julia, of making sure we really publicize that so people can sign up, and have lots of slots. So.
Well, and publicize it, and also maybe do some additional outreach if you're going to publicize it. Make some phone calls.
I think
But, yeah.
another thing that's important to point out is that there is no proposal on the table. That we're starting this process as a full board, and I'll go back to the policy committee to, really look in a way that's based on facts and our data as a district to think about what kind of reforms we might be interested in. So I heard someone in their testimony reference that, and that's an important distinction. There is no proposal on the table.
Great. So let's, we're going to circle back.
Actually, I guess I'm going to just say, there is a proposal, and doesn't, well, our policy allows community members to bring forth proposals. And there is a proposal that was brought forth by the community. It's just, I want to.
That the policy committee did not embrace, and instead we're doing a full board conversation that's inclusive of different.
I think we're just talking about semantics. There is a proposal that came forward from the community.
And the policy committee last year did make some changes and edits to it and had conversation around it.
Yeah, I mean, so it's just like, I want to be clear, because I don't want people to feel like, hey, we have a policy on policies, that you can introduce a policy, but, whether you follow it.
No, I understand that. I don't think you guys are saying different things. There's a policy that was brought forward that was under consideration last year and absolutely could be under consideration this year. I think what Amy's saying is, as a board, we have not put a proposal on the table. We're not discussing a proposal tonight on the table. We're discussing the idea in general, and then again, we'll ask some questions, come back on the 6th to give some direction, which will then result in a policy. And it may very well mirror the policy that came forward from the community. So yeah, I think
I think the policy committee last year did some important work.
So I want to move on back to Jonathan, and I think we've got some more slides to go through.
Yes, so we have 2 more sections to go through. So thank you. Can we make the slides? Thank you. The slides put here. So we're going to go focus on the PPS Parent Fund. Chair Scott, you asked which schools are in the same predicament that Beaumont is in. There are 2 additional, Buckman and Da Vinci, that both raise dollars and have active foundation and receive.
What about Chapman? Is Chapman also?
We received the PPS parent.
There today, I was looking at some data that made Chapman look like.
Yeah.
We don't need, thank you.
Chapman and Vernon have been active in the past, but not this last year.
All right, so again, want to contextualize, these are the dollars contributed to the PPS Parent Fund, not 21-22, but as you can see in the slides, 2017 to 2022. We differentiated between the contribution to the parent fund from active affiliated local school foundations. Again, that's 32 foundations, and the independent foundations are 8. So I just want to make sure that I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm just, it's information that is important for you to know. 32 active foundations, for example, this last year raised $447,000 to the parent fund, and 8 independent foundations raised $350,000. So how are PPS parent funds being budgeted by our school leaders? Here's a slide deck, or a slide that has the top 10 non-personnel items. This was essentially every principal has to budget accordingly how they're going to use these dollars. And as you can see here, the number one area over the last 3 years has been consumable supplies. And I want to be clear, this is not necessarily school supplies as much as it's family engagement. This is where principals would put family engagement, events and dinners and opportunities or other activities that happen in the school. So as you heard from one of our principals today, those are the types of, that's how the dollars get used. As you can see, the second one here being contracts, instructional, professional, and technical services at 153. So we also know that's the non-personnel. We also know that some, to Director Consum's earlier point, some of our school leaders do budget these parent fund dollars to purchase or to support, to fund staffing. And as you can see here, for the last 3 years, fiscal year 20 to 23, you can see, these are the schools with a minimum of 0.5 FTE that was supported by the fund or the parent fund, up to a little bit under 3 at Jefferson. So you can see the list there.
So I'm curious about that. So last year, the high school's got 15,000. And what did they?
Oh, I don't know.
What did they get? What did they get the 2 previous years? Because how did they buy?
Sure. No, that's a great question. It's included in one of your it's one of the many documents that we shared with you. And unfortunately, I did not. Well, actually, I did kind of labeled. It looks like this. It has 5 columns, including the PPS Parent Fund Award for 2022-2023 and carryover funds for 2021-2022. So to answer your question, I think how are they paying for them? Some, over the last few years, as you can see here, there are some schools that have budgeted, 44,000 for example, or Lane at 29,000, or Tubman 74,000. So I think a lot of it is attributed to we're making a concerted effort this last year to work with our principals to make sure that they know that the resources are there and they can utilize it accordingly.
Right. I guess. But it's not like Jefferson had, it's because they have carryover funds that they could buy FTE. Because, one of the things I hear from the schools that either get equity funds or don't have it is like even the amount of money they got, they wouldn't be able, the most they'd be able to buy is like maybe an EA FTE, which is 0.44, just based on what they got. So if their annual amount they get is, say, 45,000, they could buy one EA versus buying 4 or 5.
Sure. So I'm looking at what so you pointed out Jefferson here. Looking at the list, we're looking at, probably best to do it by year. So Jefferson, for example, total assistance over the last 4 fiscal years, funded 0.91 in educational assistance, but as you can see, it's 0.17 in 2020, 0.17 in 2021, 0.17 in 2022, and 0.4 this current fiscal year. We also see, let's see, where are the other areas?
0.17 is like 1/5 of an FTE.
Say that one more time.
0.17 is like less than 1/5 of an FTE. Is that 0.17?
0.17. So
0.2 would be a fifth. So
so less than a fifth. Yeah.
So and so in terms of, you don't see any teachers here. So at Jefferson, you're looking at this educational assistant, so it's probably topping off an assistant, FTE full time, or administrative support. Okay, the first one was the 4 years. And this is this current fiscal year, so what's happening in our schools right now. As you can see, Arleta, Jefferson, Ockley Green, Woodlawn, Beaumont, Harriet Tubman, and Lee are using parent fund dollars to pay for FTE. These are type of positions that we're looking at of how our school leaders budget that information. And I'll pause there for any questions or comments. Okay. The next item I want to turn over to.
I guess I just wanted to add in that slide. I heard from a principal. I got in my ear that they do have to describe how their equity funds or their choices for their PPS parent fund dollars are aligned with their school improvement plans, and they do have scrutiny on the decisions that they're making about how to allocate those dollars on both this foundation and parent fund choices.
So, included in your packet is all the parent fund awards. I think for the last since 2018-19. So you can see that at some point starting in 2020, 2021, the fund for PPS takes over the distribution of the parent fund. So that's why you see all hands raised logos on some and the fund for PPS logo on some other. So this last section, I'm gonna turn it over to Robin Ferrone, our Director of Strategic Partnerships. Included in your packets are 2 memos. One memo was shared with the Board of Education back in June. We just updated the date, sorry. Back in June, and that was a targeted engagement and principal survey. So we're going to have Robin give us a quick synopsis of what's in there. Obviously, you can read it at your own pleasure. And then the second one is a recent activity that we did, or a meeting that we did with a Black-led school PTA, obviously Dr. Martin Luther King PTA, and so you'll describe that as well. So I'll turn it over to you.
I think I'll start there because it's the most recent from last week. My colleague Naila Roque and I had a virtual meeting with 5 representatives from the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. School PTA. We provided the same slide deck and the Google site that we used last spring in our targeted community engagement, giving them the background on the conversations that had previously been held. And we're asking them how fundraising works in their schools. What do they think about fundraising for FTE and the district-wide? And so some of the major themes that are on the page 1 bulleted list, that they really have a perspective that the school community serves as a way of, as a family, supporting students' education and a sense of community, that they put that over fundraising, and that they actually cap fundraising for their PTA. They say we're not trying to raise more than $50,000 a year at our school. Sometimes as new families come in and they kind of socialize them to the norms of why that is, and they try to encourage people to get involved in the community, to volunteer, to be present in the school, and that will be a greater benefit to their students' education than funding alone. And they, in asking, there's here's one quote from Tiffany Robinson, the PTA president. "The biggest thing we stand for as a group is family. People feel it when they walk into our school, and new families feel it. They say it's a different feeling when they come into this school. When you walk into the office and walk the halls, you feel the love, and that means more than any dollar amount." So there's a few quotes throughout the memo, just trying to represent what was shared with us. When prompted what their recommendation was around district policies around fundraising, they said that they think that we should cap fundraising for individual schools and that schools should be willing to share with other schools who aren't able to raise money. So that is a synopsis of that memo. And the other two targeted engagements we did at Roosevelt High School and McDaniel High School with feeder schools. There is some misunderstanding in the community that we kind of handpicked people to come to those meetings. That was not the case. We did an announcement in the admin portal, which is our interoffice electronic newsletter with principals, asking them to nominate parents who are active in their school community with fundraising or volunteering. And the people that were invited were the ones that the principals identified as active in their school communities.
And just to be clear, in the Roosevelt and McDaniel community clusters.
Yeah, in their clusters.
Yeah. So it was all PPS.
Right.
It was those two specific cohorts.
But you were the ones who, your office was the one who extended the invitations and managed the whole thing.
Yes, yes. And there were some other people invited that weren't able to attend, but we did give people the opportunity to provide their feedback, and that's summarized in the other memo that is shared. So I won't go over that again. If people probably, unless you want me to.
You all could have given this as information.
Yeah.
These are 2 data points. They're not extensive engagement sessions. They were, just a perspective, a viewpoint from administrators, from parent leaders into school neighborhood, school communities, and then obviously hear what you learned from the King PTA. So we just wanted to share that information to you all.
I have a question about, I just briefly looked at didn't read through the whole packet. So I'm not as well prepared, but I did read that memo.
I told you not to go.
I know, I really appreciate that, but I got to your email a little bit late also,
Sorry.
so I was like, I wish I would have read that yesterday or done it this morning. And I appreciate that you're doing the extra engagement, for schools that it's harder for people to have a longer way to travel. But I was a little bit dismayed. I was curious as to whether the context of this conversation was presented. For instance, like a pie chart showing what the funding landscape looks like and what King School, my neighborhood school, like the sliver, right, that goes to them. And then also, it's really hard for me to understand why somebody would say, money's not an issue unless if they saw the disparity in the data and the achievement outcomes. I can't imagine that a parent would, say, it's not important, it's okay if we, we're just all about a community. If they saw the world outside of King and what was flowing to those other communities and the outcomes that increased investment is producing. I mean, I can see, like, as a parent, I didn't have time to go to King, to the PTA, wasn't involved in King. But I'm just wondering, I just saw it, it kind of broke my heart a little bit. I'm looking at Gary because it's a little traumatizing to read that people were like, oh, we're all about the family, and when there's this other world out there that is also about the family and also about investing in the kids in trips to Germany and traveling to football and basketball games and the things that our kids aren't getting, and to say that they were okay with it. It's just hard for me to believe. They knew the realm of like the possibilities of what you can do and you have a little extra money. Why would you say, oh, that's okay? We're just all about the community.
I
was
don't
just
think
curious
that
if
they
the
were
context was presented.
I mean, Tiffany Robinson has been the PTA president for several years. I think she has a pretty sophisticated understanding of the landscape. I did provide the context of it, and they did have familiarity with that. Some schools fundraise for FTE. I think their feeling is that the basic education and staffing is provided to their school, and they don't want to create an environment where the only way they're engaging with families in their community is by asking them for money. Not that they,
Yes. I
that
can
they
understand
wouldn't,
that.
they wouldn't accept a grant or a shared money or other money flowing into the school, but that's not the way they want to run their PTA.
I guess I think I understand that part, but if the magnitude of the dollars is so, it's like so much greater in other school communities that it would be, it's just hard for me to believe that we're so happy with our 38,000. When you know there's like 380,000 out there floating around to do great things with for our kids. So.
They also
I was
have
just curious. I know Tiffany.
Partnerships in their school, you know, with
Yeah.
the arts and, you know, there's a lot of
I mean, it's a great
enrichment
school
happening.
community. I love that school community. My mother and grandmother both retired from there, so.
So we have one more slide.
So anyway, I was just curious about how much context.
So that's all of, thank you. So that's all of the information that we have to share with you. Is
that it?
That's it. Hope that's enough. So December 6th work session. The purpose of that will, for you, the board, to provide general direction to us on shifts to the PPS parent fundraising policies. And here are some guiding questions. They're not meant to be exhaustive. They're not meant to be, you know, at the end of the day, you can choose to ignore all of them. I think they're really trying to provide you with us, I think as a community, the conversation that we want to have. We want to get to a solution. We want to get to a revised policy. So what parent fundraising rules and policies might need to change? Should there be caps on amount of dollars raised by parent groups? If so, what? Should dollars raised by parent groups be subjected to an equity distribution or allocation of some sort? If so, how? What updates are needed on how parent fundraising dollars are used? Right, so this is the FTE conversation, if you will. And how might we establish rules and policies that encourage fundraising efforts to be more inclusive? Kind of, I think, to what I think the Dr. King PTA was trying to, I think that's kind of the energy that I get from them, and contribute to a stronger sense of community district-wide. So I think, again, these are guiding questions for you to consider. But I think at the December 6th work session, I think, we'll turn it more over to you. We'll facilitate, if it's helpful, I'll work with the board policy chair to develop, the agenda for the work session. But really, we're turning it over to you to help our community, I think, bring closure to this topic that's been long frustrating.
So I have a question about this process because language here is all about parent groups. So it sounds like we're talking about all external sources of funding that are coming into our schools through different channels. So I want to understand, in this process through the policy committee, are we just going to focus on foundations first, which to me is kind of ironic because it's our only source of funding where we do have a equitable distribution mechanism, even though it may not be perfect and it may not be what we need, but none of our other sources do. So I would like to understand better what the parameters are on this conversation.
So I don't think there are parameters until the board gives direction to the policy committee. So that's really at December 6th. I think you just teed up another question that I think should be on the list, is how broad how broad do we want to make this?
And my next question is a very practical one. Like, do we know that universe? Like, do we know that inventory of all those other external funds that are coming in?
Just so from the policy committee, kind of how we got here is we did have a group bring forward a policy request and an idea for a policy to the policy committee that we've worked on quite hard for a couple of years. And the goal of this was to really have a next week on the 6th to kind of have a values conversation about how do we think about fundraising? How do we want to look at, I love what King says about the caps, right? Why they cap so that they can be more inclusive and some of the choices they're making there. For us to have some of that conversation. The reality is that the place where we have the most leverage is with foundations, because that is something we can directly control, whether or not people can by FTE. As we look at the whole universe of these parent or school-based fundraising, the question is, how do we help our Portland community? I think one of the speakers said, you know, moving into the Portland of today and the Portland of the future, how do we help our entire community have opportunities when we think about money in schools, parent engagement, support of one another? How do we think of that in new ways? And it becomes trickier when we look at things like PTAs because of our legal standing and relationship to them. They're their own independent 501c3s. And so how does that relationship work out? But I think if we as a board begin to have that value conversation and say, what do we want our community to be like? I loved what Will was saying about how you're working with, was it Wriggler and
Well, I'm trying to.
yeah, and on like climate change as part of community building, fundraising, like how can we take innovative ideas like that and continue to build a constellation of school-based fundraising that is equity focused, that is community building, that creates opportunities for all students. But it's going to be a process. So I think that's the conversation we have next time is what do we as a board want to set as some goal, like direction, and then the policy committee can start with the foundation policy, and then we can look at other avenues of school-based fundraising, because it does get tricky.
Can I ask a clarifying question? You said, and I get it, we have less control over like an independent school PTA, but we have control over whether that PTA can buy FTE.
Well, no, PTAs can't buy FTE. Only foundations can.
Only foundations.
Right. So a PTA can buy paper. They can give money to the principal's fund. They can do all
This is
sorts
a really
of stuff.
remedial question. I know everyone in the room
Yeah.
already knows the answer to. Where's the restriction on the PTA funding? Is that a
There's not.
PPS? No, on buying FTE.
That's a PTA.
That's that's a PTA policy.
Is that a state PTA or?
National
PPS too.
But PPS, no, I was just gonna say that PPS is also, I think that's what I said at the beginning, that PPS made a decision in '98 to say exclusively FTE will to be paid for by the local school foundation.
Yes, thank you.
So that provides that.
But
clarity.
PTA and state PTA also has some restrictions, or they give advice to schools like on things to do and not to do because of liability.
So we have about 10 minutes, and I actually want to make sure we take this time because it's an important topic. Are there additional questions? So I think that's really important. Any from the presentation, additional data questions? And I want to be clear, this is not your only opportunity. As you dig through this information, questions are going to come up. I think given the protocols conversation we've had, do this on the fly, but board members, let me know if, I think those questions should go into the superintendent, and then they will do a master tracker so that whatever answers are provided, they're provided to the entire board, in response.
What about the information we requested today?
Do you have additional?
Well, for
Oh,
example,
you mean the things that we've asked for as
the
part of
thing
this
we've asked for
session?
today, because for example, like just around the direct certification, the combined historically underserved, because I think it's important if we're going to have this discussion about middle and the steps and the cliff, that we have that we be able to kind of see how that looks, because I think we have information in like a bunch of different places that shows where the steps and the cliffs are, then it's not all just in the foundation.
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is, Jonathan and Superintendent, hopefully you've captured those. If there's clarification coming out, I would clarify with the board member that asked the question, just so we make sure we're answering the question that you wanted to answer.
So Roseanne took, Ms. Powell took notes here, and so we'll, as a staff, review those notes and potentially work with the board leadership to make sure that it's captured right. Just because I want to make sure, like I still have, I need clarity on the question that you asked.
I was going to say the same.
Data and impact.
So if there's some data readily available, or we can filter in a way that you have that full picture and visibility, great. There were some other questions that were more like, well, what if, or would require an analysis depending on how. So maybe you can help me clarify.
The other question I had is that at the very beginning of this, in addition to a community group bringing forward a policy draft for the board's and the committee's consideration, Jonathan, your office had brought forward some changes, and this wasn't related to the PTAs, but there were things like when you have a school community event, ticket availability for families that maybe can't afford it, and things like that. And I'm wondering sort of how that fits, because that seemed like part of the we're all in it together.
Sure. So I'm happy to. I think I don't remember at what point in the history of this conversation
Somewhere
that
in
was
here.
presented, but I think we'll find those, share those out with you all. Not for you to say this is the direction, this is another data point, if you will, another way to reflect on this. But ultimately, this is on the board. You know, this is on the board, and so I would say those edits to the policy at the time are just examples at this point, and I would then defer to you all to articulate the policy decision.
One thing I'd be interested in seeing is just how our equity funds are distributed, both what the criteria are, because I'm not sure I know that exactly, and then just seeing them, if we can just list that by recipients. I mean, it's included in the budget book, but it's just included as a subset of each individual school budget, so it's kind of hard to
Just one,
get to.
one listing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that would be helpful.
Just for another side-by-side comparison, I can't remember exactly.
Well,
what
that
it
was just
too.
to see the FTE purchased all together, both directly by school foundations and by the parent fund.
Yes, so I have quite a few questions, so I probably will send them in as well. But I just want to make sure that I have them out just in case I forget. Just send them in. So one of the questions I have is we can get the data disaggregated based on our board goals for these schools.
Speak up a little bit.
I'm sorry. We can get the disaggregated data based on our board goals for the schools, run by population and the performance.
For all schools or those with foundations?
The active and independent schools, active affiliated and independent separated schools.
Can I just clarify? Demographic data, when you say population, you mean the demographic data, and when you say performance, you mean the student achievement data.
Based on our board, based on our board goals.
It would be like evaluating against those goals.
Right. Another question I have, I don't know if you can answer it now, but when I look at the numbers, when it says less than 1% of licensed PPS staff and just over 1% of our budget of teaching assistants, could we as a district absorb this amount with more priority budgeting?
More what?
Priority budget. And also with the foundation pieces, if they raise funds for 2021, 2022 school year, and they don't raise funds the next year, what happens to those staff that is purchased? And then we'd like to know what is the average amount that is going to non-active schools, the non-active affiliate schools. What's the average amount that they're receiving? And then community outreach piece. I think it's going to be very, very important to really have a robust community outreach piece for all the schools, because I think this is something that a lot of the parents, and I know it don't have to be all 81, but some way to make sure that we are reaching all parents to get an understanding of what's going on, and also to ask, their thoughts, because so when I hear parents talk about, well, if we as an example, got rid of it and all kids are going to go to private schools. Well, I'm one of those parents that actually sent their kids to private schools, so I paid that tuition bill. But I do know that the private schools can't take in all the schools that everybody leaves. So, when I hear that, it just kind of makes me cringe a little bit. But also too, I wanted to push back on the notion that if, as an example, if we did away with foundation pieces as far as parents paying for, that the collective community would not donate for the good of the whole. I don't think we are as shallow as a community that if we can't raise money just for our school, we're going to just hold our money to ourselves. I just don't think that of us as a community. And so, when those things come out, it brings me pause, because I don't think that's how we are as a community. I think we are a community of giving. We are a community of looking at those other kids that are other schools or kids that are not doing well and want to help out and lend a helping hand. And we have evidence of that by the bond, by the levy stuff. So I just wanted to make sure that for me, you know, I do give. You know, I am one of the fortunate folks who financially I'm okay, but I do give, and it's not based on where just because my kid is at this school or just because my kid is at that school. And so I think we have more of us out there like that versus those that, well, I'm not going to give if it's not going to just affect my kid's school. And that's one of the reasons why I really think that community outreach is important, because I think as we hear more of that from our community, then we can really have a path forward to say, you know what, maybe they are willing to do this, or maybe are not willing to do this, but at least want to hear from the community, their thoughts about these things. Well, that's all I gotta say.
So, Vice Chair Hollins, I'll send the board this document. I think that was referenced by a public comment that gets to some of those questions around achievement. Now this data is, pre-pandemic, and obviously things have shifted, but this gives you an example. I mean, because again, I think we know, yes, that Forest are, Dunaway, director certification, poverty levels are really low, right? And achievements are really high.
Yes.
And so,
And we're not just talking about foundation dollars. When you have affluent neighborhoods, and I live right down the street from Alameda. I live across the street, down the street from Beaumont. The foundation dollars, that's not necessarily what we're talking about, the inequities pieces. Those folks that have money was going to do extra things anyway for their kids, whether they're going to hire extra tutors for their kids or whether they're going to have get the necessary things or put finances into their kids to do it. So I don't necessarily think we're talking about just the foundation dollars when we talk about wealthier schools. We're talking about all the external stuff that we know that wealthier systems or wealthier communities have. So I want to make sure we're not talking about, well, if we take it from, I'm just using an example, Lincoln, that they're not going to have resources for their kids. We know they're going to have resources for their kids. Alameda, we know they're going to have resources for their kids. Beaumont, we know they're going to have resources for their kids. So I want to make sure we're not talking about, oh, we take this from, or limit them, or if they don't get it, that their kids, they're not going to make sure that their kids are taken care of because they have resources to do that. So I just want to make sure that's from my own personal experience. I make sure my kids had the best they had with the finances I had. I realized not a lot of kids have that option. A lot of families don't have that option, so that's kind of where I'm coming from. And doing that, I know that, yes, we can put more money into kids or schools that don't have that. Yes, we can do this, but to say that, if we get rid of this in whatever way, shape, or form, that won't happen. I don't want to put that misnomer out there, because before they had foundations, PPS had foundations, affluent families was still doing well with their kids. Their academic performance was still doing well before this. So I don't want to make it seem like if this is going to make or break any kids from academic achieving.
Thanks, Gary.
Chair Scott, I'm sorry.
Oh, absolutely.
Just wanted to note, because you can't see up here, that Byrony is in the meeting and she has her hand raised.
Oh, Byrony, you know what? And I feel really bad. Byrony, you emailed earlier and let me know you're going to be virtual. And you know what? I didn't see your name up there. And so I absolutely want to turn over the floor to you.
Yeah, no problem. It's okay. A lot of my questions were being.
Byrony is our student representative, for those who don't know. Go ahead.
Yeah, and a lot of my questions have been asked by the meeting by other board members, so I really did not feel the need, or I would have gotten my voice in there. But just since we're at the very end, I think a couple of questions I have is I want to understand the significance of foundation dollars versus the significance of PTAs and the other fundraising avenues we talked about. I'd love to know if foundations are actually raising significantly more than those other bodies, just to kind of understand how each of those are affecting overall. I also just want to echo what Director Lowry said about how I think ultimately this is definitely going to come down to a values conversation and what's doable and what's going to be the best for students. And so I also think I heard a lot of plans, like I heard from public comment, there's this idea of maybe a universal foundation. Also, I know that we had the policy in works last year, which I don't really know much about. So I'd love to someone could shoot me an email or if I could be directed to whatever that policy work says, just so that I'm prepared for our next conversation, or just be directed to where I can find that. In terms of like what was in the works last year in the policy committee. And I'd love to understand a bit more like the viability of like these other solutions. I think as we move forward into the next conversation about trying to direct staff into what we might want to do, I'd love to have some understanding kind of the pros and cons of some of these other methods that we're looking at in terms of how we can balance this funding. But that's it. And thank you for the information. I found it very informative. And I will email any other questions as I dig more into the presentation and the data that you shared. So thank you.
Thank you, Byron.
I had a comment about the timeline.
Oh, good. That's a good segue because I was going to ask the board again how they feel about the timeline. So.
Yeah, and so this is somewhat dependent upon what we sort of hear back and where we decide, but to me, if there is sort of a marrying of other things that we may change in the rest of our budget that marries to policy changes, again, I don't know what the policy changes will land, but for me, that would be an important, like, again, it seems like we have an equity formula that we currently use, and this helps more of higher SES schools. And so is there something we can, which seems like it tilts a little, a little bit, not a massive amount, but it tilts it. And so are there things in the budget that, again, we're raising everybody? So this question, if it's good to have an EA or a reading specialist in every school, I'd really like this superintendent to weigh in on that topic, and what we can do and to look at the smoothing out the cliffs. And to me, that seems like it, unless you marry it with the budget conversation, then it's like you might just get half of the fix, and half the fix isn't the fix.
Yeah, no shortage of ideas. As you know, we don't have clarity on our revenue because it'll keep iterating from February to May. And so we have to prepare sort of budget recommendation ABC. But if we're hearing sort of desire to prioritize, take Gary's example, if we were to do a heat map against the board goals and created an intervention and support fund and prioritize schools by students furthest away from those goals and gave them a short menu of what those intervention supports could look like for targeting support. That's one scheme. If we believe, early education supports in kindergartens could be another scheme, So we can come up with sort of some strategies, but it's a matter of cost benefit estimates and perceived benefit, and to see how we can have schools across the portfolio experience additional support.
And maybe it's not staff FTE either, maybe it's like high dosage tutoring delivered by some of our partners, community partners.
So let's go back and think, and I think that the observation is a great one in terms of if we are going to be marrying up changes with policy and budget changes, then how do we do that next spring? In terms of this immediate time frame.
Sorry, I just want to make sure for the context, I want to make sure it's clear that the policy change around the funding of FTE by private donations has never and will not supplant the work of the district, and I just want to make sure that that's clear.
Important.
So as well, I appreciate the conversation. Like, it's important to have those discussions. I just want to make sure that it's not one or the other, because that's what creates.
I'm actually trying to get away from you're going to take something away, because if the superintendent tells me that, like, hey, those 4 FTE or EAs in Dunaway or the extra ones in Buckman or Chapman or Beaumont make a difference to student outcomes, like, I want to be able to look at it holistically then at the budget, like in an ad versus a
So I'm going to ask the superintendent. I mean, because that's a you're asking for a data point there. I don't know. I don't know. Dr. Adams is not here. Right. Are we going to be able to point that one EA is making a plus or minus in student outcome impact? That's the question that I'm hearing.
Well, I guess The argument here's, I guess, what I'm trying to hear is like all the different parents that I listen to in the community, and that is like I have heard from parents and staff at very affluent schools, like, hey, we still have kids that need personalized supports, and that's what we use our funding for. Like, and if you look at the numbers, actually, every single school on the top earners has more than X number of more than 20% of students who are combined underserved or not achieving. Like, I don't think we have any schools at 100%. So if you're saying like that's where the money is going to, and like don't pay it because our kids don't need it, but I'm saying there's going to be other schools where that's totally true, but they don't have the foundation, or they don't maybe have the equity funds, or they don't have the flexibility of the equity funds. And I guess so I don't know if that is formulated
That's
into a
sort of
question.
the next tier of schools we want to get to, right? What we know is the schools that are showing improvement are implementing a coherent set of strategies. Some we believe are high leverage, others at the school level with their leader are making decisions about. So, there isn't a clean causal sort of investment to a result, but we know it's a contributing factor. And, I want to we'll entertain the question, but I want to sit with Dr. Adams and his team and sort of see what we can do because I think I know where we're sort of trying to get shape and direction towards. These things all work in concert.
Yeah.
So back to the question about timing. Right now, we're scheduled to come back on December 6th and provide some direction to the policy committee to move forward. Does the board feel comfortable with that timeline? Just looking for nods at this point.
I maybe I want clarity leaving this meeting. So I heard Director or Vice Chair Hollins talk about community engagement. So I just want to make sure I have clarity on, is there an because if there's an expectation on engagement, then we're looking at a further than March decision, one, and then two, that will mean that staff will have to go back to the drawing board. We've identified our engagement activities for the year. And so, they're based on our work plan. And so we would have to work with the superintendent. I just want to make sure
That's a great point. So I mentioned the idea of at least of listening sessions. I think the timing of those is up in the air, right? I don't think those listening sessions necessarily are going to be very beneficial early, but I think they will be more beneficial as the policy process moves along. And so I totally hear what you're saying about capacity, and we need to do it right, because if we're going to do it, we need to be inclusive and do outreach and make sure we're bringing all voices to the table. Which is, by the way, I meant to say earlier, thank you to everyone who came to testify tonight. I actually really valued that, and I'm really glad we hear different perspectives. And I'm hoping that when we talk about listening sessions, I think it's going to move forward for all of us to hear that.
Chair Scott, I just want to, we want to be transparent, and sometimes when we have a listening session, after some work has happened, there's a perception that input is coming in too late. So I want us to balance, if we're doing this as a community and we're co-creating, then we have the listening sessions earlier rather than later.
Yeah.
We also have the mechanism of the 21-day like once there is a thing, there's also the 21-day comment period where you could build in variety of listening.
So that's down the road. How do we feel about December 6th and giving staff direction? Or
what are we going to do in between now and
our job in between now and then is to read through this material, to send additional questions to the superintendent if you have any, to read the questions, the answers we get from staff, the questions that have come in, and then really come to that December 6th ready, again, we're not making a decision at December 6th, but ready to give your personal sense of, from a policy perspective, do you want to see changes? And the answer doesn't have to be yes, right? It's either yes or no, do you want to see changes? If the answer is yes, what are those? And kind of coming back to the questions that Jonathan framed up, plus a couple.
And I think the most fundamental helpful question to the policy committee is, should we continue to allow foundations to fund FTE? I mean that's the sort of like basic, we start there, and then if we say yes to that, then we can have some more of the philosophical questions, but that sort of sense of what does that boil down to?
And we'll bring we'll share additional data based on this conversation. Again, we'll convene and based on things that we heard, like you have interest in PTA. We have some available data from 990s that our team has done some research on, but again, because they're independent, we don't have all those details, but we can provide like the fact that 71 of our schools have a PTA. If you're part of a PTA, you to be a member of PTA, you have to pay dues, right? So that creates challenges for, so there are things that are happening in other foundation or in other fundraising worlds that, you know, again, based on the discussion, we'll provide details for you to further explore as a board.
Okay, so I'm not hearing anyone object to that, so we're going to stay on that timeline moving forward. Last thing I'm just going to say as we wrap up, I wonder if there's not a guiding principle here of our targeted universalism that we can sort of apply. And I keep reflecting back. Michelle and I both saw Dr. Powell a few months ago now.
The photo op.
Yeah, the follow-up, right? Sort of talk about this, and it just as the superintendent was talking, and I'm thinking back to our session last week. I mean, we have been doing this very explicitly as a district around schools, and looking at, you know, the idea of targeted universalism is how are we similarly situated people should be treated similarly, right? And so looking at our schools has been the proxy for that, and we've sort of gone after our designated schools, and that's the right place to start. We've got this complication as schools are transitioning out of that, and we've got those schools in the middle. But I also heard from a lot of people, and including people who testified, like, but what are we doing about the individual students, right? And so, you know, you can have a really high performing school, and you can have a child who can't read in that school, and that is still like just morally wrong, right? And so, as I was going through tonight's conversation, I just kept coming back to that conversation, and I kept hearing Dr. Powell in my head, sort of like that should be the guiding principle as we look at these policy changes of like, how are we continuing to drive the district towards making sure the resources are going to the kids who most need it, the kids who are similarly situated, you know, at all ranges, right? From high performing to underperforming. Like, how are we situating all of our decisions around that? So,
with that context, I think it's really important that all the data we have always be accompanied, but, you know, be disaggregated, and that also be attached to student outcomes, because that's, I mean, that's what we're trying to impact. Because, you know, looking at the presentation, because there's so much data. It's like, what do we leave off? But I think it's really important to keep that piece there, and I really appreciate it. Andrew, you saying that, like, in every school we have kids who aren't achieving, and, you know, that our mission as a school district is to make sure that every student leaves our district.
Thank you, everyone, for the conversation. We are adjourned.